Today is January 22nd, 2026, and today we will be discussing the Gaza Board of Peace that was recently established in accordance with the Gaza peace proposal that was brokered in October of 2025 by the Trump administration. Now, this is the beginning of the second phase of the ceasefire, the peace proposal that was brokered. In the first phase, of course, we know that there was supposed to be an exchange of Palestinian prisoners for the remaining Israeli hostages. There's still an Israeli hostage that hasn't been returned, so technically the first phase actually hasn't been completed, but they've decided to move on to the second phase. Also, Hamas is not disarmed, which was also supposed to be part of the first phase of the truce, the peace proposal. And so I've said on several occasions that the proposal is already basically broken apart. There is fighting that's continued, although it's not at the same intensity as it was before the peace proposal. And so I would argue that at this point, it's very unlikely that we're going to see too much effectiveness from this Board of Peace or the technocrats, the Palestinian technocrats that will actually be governing the Gaza Strip, be too effective. But first, I really wanted to comment on some recent developments with Trump's initiatives as it relates to Trump's initiative to take over Greenland. In our previous episode, we did sort of a deep dive on some of the dynamics related to Trump and if he was to acquire Greenland, how that would look from a political and a commercial standpoint. But over at the Davos convention, in the course of the past 2 days, after a lot of bombast and rhetoric from the Trump administration, from threats to EU countries and NATO, it seems like there were some backdoor conversations that were taking place, negotiations that were taking place behind the scenes. And basically, we have statements from Trump, from President Trump, about a deal that's been reached. We haven't gotten too many details on that deal just yet, but we've got sort of a rough sketch of what those negotiations yielded at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And so this is from the New York Times. Negotiations to resolve the future of Greenland have focused in recent days on proposals to increase NATO's presence in the Arctic and give America a sovereign claim to pockets of Greenland's territory and block potentially hostile adversaries from mining the island's minerals. And so this proposal essentially will deal with both the national security interest that the U.S. has and, of course, the commercial interest with the rare earths. And so we haven't had too many details, as I just said, but critically, the thing to understand is the proposal that was brokered stopped short of Trump's goal of acquiring the island outright or purchasing it or using military force to take it. In fact, he said in his speech at Davos yesterday that he was ruling out the use of military force to take over Greenland. So he was kind of already retreating, and I'm sure that he was doing that knowingly because they were close to reaching a deal, right? So a lot of the rhetoric by Trump and the administration was obviously used to sort of bring the European Union, maybe Denmark even in particular, to the table for negotiations. He likely never even wanted to use military force to begin with. And I would applaud him for using diplomacy, right, behind the scenes. Yeah, there was a lot of bluster and rhetoric, but I'm glad he chose to take the diplomatic route, negotiate. He didn't need to take over the island. There's no need for it. It's, as I've said before, it would have been better to work with the EU and Greenland to forge some kind of agreement to share whatever commercial endeavors that the U.S. undertakes in the future, or military basing rights and this kind of thing. And so just briefly here, the proposal would include the creation of a significant new NATO mission in the Arctic, based in Greenland, of course. It would update a pact signed between Denmark and the United States in 1951, as you know, Denmark owns Greenland. Greenland is semi-autonomous, but they are the formal owners, or the formal custodians, if you will, of Greenland. And that 1951 pact actually gave the U.S. military-wide access to Greenland, and for operations, including the construction and operation of military bases. And so there was already this sort of agreement in place that the U.S. could station troops there, build more military bases there, etc. They're at a low point right now. I actually don't have the number off the top of my head, but during the Cold War, there were more military personnel, several hundred more military personnel in Greenland during the Cold War than there are right now. It wasn't until over the course of the, following the end of the Cold War that many of those U.S. assets were withdrawn from Greenland. But there is a pact in place. And so that pact is essentially going to be expanded. It says here, quote, American officials have said they are concerned that this access, and they're talking about the access that we currently have, could be curbed by a change of government in Greenland. And this is one of the reasons why they were making the case to take over the island altogether. But of course, what would that entail? You have to think about the costs of doing that, basically reconstructing Greenland's political apparatus and infrastructure and bureaucracy, which would take, let's say that the time it would take to do that would outlast Trump's presidency. And we have to consider, as we talked about before, the energy and the resources and the time and the risk involved in that endeavor. You might not have the outcome that you're looking for that would foster the kind of investment that you need to reconstruct rare earth supply chains. So this would expand the 1951 agreement, and the pact in the new agreement would effectively create pockets of American soil in the territory. So that would be interesting to see how that'll come to fruition. It goes on to say such an agreement would likely be modeled on a sovereign base area agreement in Cyprus. This would be modeled on the Cyprus situation, where Britain's military bases are regarded as British territory. That would give the United States greater control over the land that it currently exerts over U.S. embassy sites. So it would be essentially, a lot of the bases would act as an embassy. And lastly here, it would restrict non-NATO member countries, particularly Russia and China, from obtaining rights to mine the rare earth minerals that lie deep under Greenland's ice sheet. And Russia, I don't believe, have any interests in doing that kind of mining, at least not that I know of. China likely would, as we discussed in our recent video. China does have a contract on one of the largest mines in Greenland right now. And so it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, if they decide to retreat from that, or if they seek any kind of damages. They haven't really produced anything. It's not operational. Chinese aren't operating a mine or anything, but they have contractual rights for related to that particular mine. And so one of the reasons that they haven't actually started developing that mine is because the infrastructure is just not there. And if you want to hear more about the lack of mining infrastructure and commercial interest, you can look at the previous video on that. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that Trump, likely the entire time, he wanted to go this route, and the bluster and the threats were just a way of cajoling the Europeans to the table so he can get a better deal. But it's good that it's, for at least on the face of it, we'll probably cover this in more length as more information comes out later on, but it's good that on the face of it, diplomacy seems to have won the day. But getting to our main story about the Gaza Board of Peace, Trump announced, this was early last Friday, the creation of the Board of Peace. And he said it would administer the Gaza Strip, or be an overseer of a technocratic civil government run by Palestinians until such time that the Palestinians could take over completely, or the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank could take over. Now, it was created to oversee the construction of post-war Gaza, but its charter, which was drafted by the White House, says the board's goal is to promote stability, restore dependable and lawful governance, and secure enduring peace in areas affected or otherwise threatened by conflict. And so, yes, in the Board of Peace was created in the context of the Gaza peace proposal, but it isn't specifically a body that's going to be, it's not going to be limited to the Gaza Strip, right? Its authority will go beyond the Gaza Strip. Specifically, as we just said, it's going to be taking part in areas of the world that are threatened or affected by conflict. And that's kind of an open statement there. Now, one of the things that I was thinking about as I went through some of these details, and as I've been covering this for quite some time now, is perhaps this Board of Peace, that's and there are rumors going around that this is kind of going to be, that this Board of Peace will be a competitor to the UN, right? Overseen by Trump, and the U.S. having exclusive authorities that we'll get into over the Board of Peace and its members, like sort of like vetoing power. And if this is what they're saying, it is that Trump is denying this, and he's saying this organization, this group will be working in conjunction, in tandem with the UN. But if it is a separate multinational entity like the UN that operates, sort of in its own sphere, and Trump is the head of it, I was thinking this might be an opportunity for him to have some kind of international authority after he leaves the presidency. This might be a way for him to cement his way, or to continue operating, at least in the international scene, after his presidency, a way of retaining authority. So it's interesting to see how that'll go. But later, again, Trump made clear that he would, the board's remit would be expanded, of course, that, like we just went over, it would go beyond Gaza to tackle other conflicts. It would work in tandem with the UN, and member states would be limited to 3-year term limits unless they pay $1 billion each to fund the board's activities and earn permanent membership. And this is according to the charter. And Trump also reiterated that the process has moved, that again, we've moved to the second phase of the agreement, even though there were some areas that weren't tied up. And specifically, when we look at the peace proposal that was brokered last year, this second part of the agreement involves point 6 and point 9. We went over each point in a separate video, but in point 6 said that once all hostages are returned, Hamas members would commit to peaceful coexistence and to decommission their weapons. And they will be given an amnesty. Members of Hamas who wish to leave Gaza will be provided safe passage to receiving countries. And the way that this is structured, when we looked at the peace proposal before, it wasn't divided up into phases. And so the way that phase 2 is working now, the demilitarization of Hamas is going to be included in phase 2. Whereas originally they were saying it was going to be phase 1. But as I've said previously, I never thought that Hamas would relinquish any of their heavy weaponry or small firearms, because there's nobody to administer that process and regulate it. And so, of course, on point 9 of the peace proposal, it goes as follows. Gaza will be governed under the temporary transitional governance of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee responsible for delivering the day-to-day running of the public services and municipalities for the people of Gaza. And the committee will be made up of qualified Palestinians and international experts, with oversight and supervision by the new international body, which is the Board of Peace that Trump has just announced. Now, this phase also includes the expectation that Israel would withdraw from additional parts of the Strip. As we know, the Strip is basically vertically bisected right now. There's a demilitarized zone that's being overseen by the IDF. And there was no mention in the timeline for the withdrawal or phased withdrawal of the IDF in this particular phase. But the withdrawals were ostensibly supposed to be linked to the demilitarization, so that's likely why we haven't seen any kind of withdrawals right now. Israel hasn't even received the last body. They haven't disarmed like we talked about. And I would say that even after the final body is received, negotiations related to disarmament will go on indefinitely, which means that the IDF won't be withdrawing anytime soon. I can guarantee you that Israel will draw out those negotiations as long as they possibly can, whether they get the body back or not. So Trump is, of course, going to be the chair of the Board of Peace. And he said he supports a Palestinian Technocratic Committee, which we just went over in point 9. And that Technocratic Committee was appointed this week to manage Gaza during what he described as a period of transition. And I haven't seen I think I did see who would be the head of that committee, but I didn't see who all would make up the committee. And we probably won't, because again, these are bureaucrats, basically. They're going to be, civil workers that are going to be managing the Strip, overseen by the Board of Peace. And I would wager that many of these people were within the Gaza Strip political community before, right? I'm not sure that there are too many outsiders, maybe like, for example, from the West Bank or any Arab countries, that are going to be making up the civilian infrastructure that's going to be managing the day-to-day operations in the Strip. So the Board of Peace is expected to be formally unveiled. It was unveiled at the World Economic Forum. There was a big signing ceremony. And Witkoff said Wednesday that 25 countries so far have accepted the invitation of the Board of Peace. Now, in announcing the transition to phase 2 of the plan of the war, Witkoff also announced the establishment, as we said, of the committee. He stressed that the United States expects Hamas, of course, to comply with its obligations, which they have said they would be doing. And almost simultaneously with Witkoff's announcement, the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian factions led by Hamas issued separate statements expressing full support and agreement with the committee and the move to phase 2. And it's important to keep in mind that this is one of the reasons that demilitarization didn't take place yet, right? If it was going to be demilitarization overseen by the IDF, Hamas was probably, worried that they would end up, if the IDF was overseeing it or regulating it, that they would just end up getting killed. So we're going to go through the list of countries that we have, a small list of countries that were included, and these include Israel, who recently accepted the proposal to be on the board, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Turkey, Hungary, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia, and Belarus. Russia, I don't believe they formally made a commitment to join the Board of Peace. They put out Trump said they did. The administration said they accepted, but then the Kremlin came out later on and said that they're studying the proposal and they're leaning into it. They're also wanting to use some of their frozen assets. The Russians want to use some of their frozen assets to pay the $1 billion to be permanent members of the board. So other countries have declined to join, such as NATO, Sweden, Italy, and France said they intended to decline. And Trump said that he would end up imposing like a 200% tariff on wines and champagnes that come from France. So keep that in mind, all the wine drinkers. And many of these countries have refused, again, because of the similarities between this Board of Peace and the direction that Trump wants to take it, how closely it resembles the UN. And there are a lot of international legal matters that need to be hammered out and discussed before these countries feel comfortable in co-signing on this Board of Peace. Britain, Britain is expected to take the same position. Germany and Japan, they've really not taken too much of a position yet. And Ukraine is hesitant because Zelensky says that he doesn't like the idea of having to share or to share um, to participate when Putin is likely going to accept the invitation. He doesn't want to sit on the same board as Putin when they're at war. So now, regarding Israel's posture at the second stage, as the second stage has been introduced, again, as of the 21st of this month, Israel yesterday agreed to join the Board of Peace, even as hostilities continue in the Gaza Strip. And all signs point toward Israel consolidating their position on the eastern part of the Strip they occupy. And I say that because even though they're participating in this Board of Peace, it's important to realize that their regional ambitions within the Middle East are still initiatives that they want to see fulfilled, right? Acquisition, annexation of the West Bank, complete takeover of the Gaza Strip. Jared Kushner actually at Davos presented, once again, we discussed this before, but he presented another blueprint for real estate development in the Gaza Strip. And that includes the area that the enclave the Palestinians are in right now, and of course, where the IDF is. And so in the backdrop, Israel will participate, but they're not going to set aside their regional ambitions in the Middle East or, of course, their ambitions in the Gaza Strip. The BBC reports that the BBC reported the other day they had satellite imagery that showed these concrete barriers that demarcate the line of separation between the IDF and the rest of the Gaza Strip. These markers have been moved incrementally in certain parts closer and closer to the coast, as likely by the IDF. They're concrete bollards. And again, they demarcate the IDF security zone, and they've been moved in at least 16 places. And you have to also consider, as we think about Israel's posture, it was about a week ago, the IDF military chief had said that he said, quote, "The yellow line is a new border line serving as a forward defensive line for our communities and a line of operational activity." And so again, Israel is going to play both sides of this. They're going to make sure that they placate Trump and join the Board of Peace and make gestures toward peace and toward the overarching peace deal. But their ambitions are still there. And you'll see this kind of unfolding as time goes on, especially, as I said earlier, when negotiations start for the decommissioning of military hardware by Hamas. And so the formation of the governing and security apparatus and all the negotiations in between is what Israel is relying on to buy the time and consolidate these processes. Like I said, will be drawn out indefinitely. And of course, that exponentially increases the likelihood of hostilities starting back. Because if at any point in time, Israel is able to convince Trump and the US that Hamas is being implacable, they're being intransigent, then Trump will likely say, well, if they're not going to cooperate, just go in and finish the job, and then it starts all over again. And that's very likely the course it's going to take when we start to get into the weeds, into the technical negotiations that are going to take place. Now, you have to consider, we're going to go to point 16 of the peace proposal and how vague the language is as it relates to withdrawing. Right, Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza, is what it says, as the ISF, and this is the temporary security force that hasn't been created yet. It's supposed to be a multinational security force that's supposed to help, in conjunction with the technocratic government, manage the Gaza Strip. Many countries that have been called to participate in this security apparatus have rejected the idea altogether. Some of them are hesitant to, especially the Arab countries are hesitant to station their security forces in the Gaza Strip because of how politically advantageous that would look. It wouldn't look too good on their part. So there's been a lot of hesitation creating from countries when it comes to sharing that security responsibility with Israel and the U.S. and the Gaza Strip. But as going back to the point, as the ISF establishes control and stability, the IDF will withdraw based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization that will be agreed upon between the IDF, the ISF, the Multinational Security Organization, the guarantors, and the United States, with the objective of a secure Gaza that can no longer pose a threat to Israel, Egypt, or its citizens. Think about that language there. And again, we talked about it before, so I won't linger on it too much, but what are those what are the standards and the milestones and timeframes that they're linking to linked to the demilitarization that they're talking about? All of those points, those milestones and standards will all have to be negotiated. And again, that's going to be the process that's drawn out. And you can't forget that Trump's peace plan also envisions the deployment, as we just talked about, of an international security force in Gaza. The western half of the Strip is going to likely be left ruinous. This is just a prediction, and unlivable. And most of those people are going to likely leave. That's just the way it is. While these negotiations are going on, very little aid is getting into the Palestinians. And that's going to and you have to understand also the utility issue. There's rampant disease going on there because of the climate and the lack of utilities and this kind of thing on the western part of the Gaza Strip, where most of the Palestinians are. And so it's just a waiting time. Negotiate indefinitely, starve the people, make sure they don't have adequate that the utilities aren't working and there isn't adequate care and aid getting into that area. Many of them will likely voluntarily leave. As we covered in a previous episode, there are already flights of Palestinians sponsored by Israelis leaving that area of the Gaza Strip. And so they're banking on time and a potential redeployment into that area. And the Borders Charter says its chairman will have, and so that section that I just covered, that's what I'm talking about there. That's Israel's posture in all of this. Again, to reiterate, they'll participate formally, but these goals and ambitions that they've had for all along for the Gaza Strip remain in place, and they're just incrementally working towards those goals as the peace process continues. You can't even, as I've said before, the peace process really isn't even there. It's fallen apart because of the lack of management, but also because certain milestones haven't been met. And so every time a milestone hasn't been met, we're just kind of kicking the can down the road or moving the goalposts. But back to the Board of Peace itself, Trump is the executive of this Board of Peace, which makes, again, many countries that were invited hesitant to participate. He'll have extensive executive power, including the ability to veto decisions and remove members subject to some constraints. So far, we don't know what those constraints are, but that's quite a lot of power to wield when you're sharing the responsibility, allegedly, of rebuilding a war zone, a war-torn area, right? So Trump would be the executor of it. And this is why I said this position that he holds over this body could easily transition out of the presidency in 2028 to just the sole head of this body and still wield probably a considerable amount of power, depending on who's president in the US. So it doesn't talk about like rotating presidents. You know what I mean? That's what's conspicuously absent from all this, is the idea that, okay, well, when Trump is finished with his term as president, the next president, whoever is elected, is going to take over this body. That's that kind of language. We haven't seen any of it yet. So it remains unclear how commitments and enforcement tools will be shared amongst its members, and how the board will function in practice in tandem with the technocratic Palestinian government that's going to be in place there. So it's clear that there isn't going to be progress on fulfillment of the ceasefire terms unless there's strong, steady, patient U.S. commitment, as we've said several times before, and a counterweight and pressure on the parties, especially Israel, moving forward. This is something that I don't think that Trump wants to do in any ways. And, there have been signs, I think, I have to be fair, there have been signs that, he's putting pressure on Israel to, stick to the proposal regime and work through each point. But I think that Trump is more susceptible to the idea of Hamas in some way throwing a wrench in the middle of this. And so we hear a lot of language still to this day that, if they don't comply, if Hamas doesn't comply, Israel's going back in and they're going to take care of business. We're going to wipe them off the map and this kind of thing. And so I don't think he's averse to putting pressure on all the parties, but it's something that, you really just have to have his ear. And the main person in all of this who has Trump's ear is Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel. But in order, again, for this to work, you have to have the commitment and the patience and the time and the political capital to see it through, because it's a years-long process. I would even say before rebuilding starts, it's going to be a years-long process, because if you want to rebuild, you've got to have some kind of civilian political apparatus in place. And there needs to be some, again, stability. Can't be chaotic. And of course, any long-term Israeli plan to continue to occupy the territory beyond the demarcation line would mean that Gaza would never be allowed to reconstitute itself and function as a functional society. The war would just basically continue if Israel is planning on reneging on the idea of phased withdrawals, right? And the ultimate consequence of an indefinite occupation or even annexation of the Gaza territory, demarcated by the yellow line, could be that the rest remains in ruins, right? And as we talked about earlier, if it does, then you don't even have to remove the rest of the Palestinians forcibly, but they'll leave voluntarily, many of them, which is, again, another form of soft ethnic cleansing. So the establishment of an international stabilization force is going to be necessary. Steady diplomacy and negotiations amongst all the parties are going to be necessary, which make the negotiations even more difficult, because everybody is going to want a piece of something. And so what you have to have is a talented and discerning statesman that can find a way to balance all of these different interests from these different countries that are going to be participating in this project. Now, do I think that Trump can do that? No, I don't. But fingers crossed, maybe he will. It's just, as I've said, a huge investment. And in a previous video, I mentioned he's got several irons in the fire right now. And it's going to be difficult to manage all of those, especially with midterms and political capital steadily running out as time goes on. So we'll see what happens with this, and we'll be following it closely. The next video we'll probably be doing on Greenland. But that should do it for us today. And if you like the video, hit the like button. If you like the channel, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, and let me know what you think. Thanks.